Again, I think this is all wishful thinking coming out of the Kremlin. And as has been reported, there are some senior voices in the Kremlin and in Moscow who are now voicing their concerns that these are completely unrealistic aspirations. Now, this is pretty remarkable. We haven't heard anything like this coming out of Moscow in the last 3 years. And if people now feel prepared to suggest that Putin's got it wrong, then that gives us hope, actually, that people close to Putin are realizing that they need to change tack, and hopefully that change of tack is to the peace negotiation table. I think the other thing that's clear with the death of a Russian general in the last couple of weeks in Moscow, which is the second or third senior Russian general who has been killed. People in Moscow, people in the Kremlin are also realizing that they're fearing for their own safety, and that the selfishness with some of the senior Russian leaders is more likely to get them to voice their concerns to Putin than anything else. But any aspiration I think Putin has to take the four oblasts in the next few months are completely unrealistic. And the quicker he realizes that, the better for everybody, I believe.
Also, according to the Washington Post has conducted many interviews with former and current Russian soldiers and military commanders, and some Russian soldiers complaining about the corruption among Russian commanders, businessmen, and some of the soldiers also accused Russia's military command and big business of opposing a peace deal because they are benefiting from the wartime spending, from Putin's wartime spending. What is your take on that? Do you feel that there are also could be some people in the military, in the Russian business, who oppose peace deal because they are not happy to stop receiving this big wartime spending, not happy to stop managing this big Russian funds?
Unfortunately, it might seem incongruous to us here in the West, in sort of democratic world, but that is probably very, very likely. It is clear that some of Putin's close aides, some of the elite in Russia do own the factories, which are now generating billions and billions of rubles and dollars worth of profit for those who own them. And those rich people, these are the oligarchs who've got their super yachts in the Mediterranean, ski chalets in Europe, etc., and their private jets. They are making a fortune out of this war, and it's quite believable that they want things to carry on so they can keep on making money. It's a mark of these sort of people, how sort of selfish they are. But I think it's well been known that the Russian state has been corrupt for years, and when you have a tyrannical leader like Putin and an autocratic way of leadership, this tends to happen. Again, it's incongruous to us, but I am sure that those people who are making a fortune are the strongest voices behind Putin, telling him that he should keep going, because it's not them who are having to fight at the front line. It's not their children, I expect, who are fighting and dying in the Donbass and elsewhere on the front line. So unfortunately, I expect there is a lot of truth in the rumours that those factory owners are keen to see the war going on so they can keep lining their pockets with more and more rubles and gold, no doubt.
Also, according to the Washington Post, Vladimir Putin is really in difficult situation, as you previously mentioned, because an unconvincing victory, Russian unconvincing victory, could bubble up into the kind of discontent that fuels Wagner force mutiny in 2023. So Putin is afraid of accepting a peace deal which would not be convincing, would not be seen as a convincing Russia's victory. What is your take on that?
Well, I think it's interesting that he sacked some senior generals recently. I tend to forget about Prigozhin, who was leader of the Wagner group, who did lead the rebellion against the Russians, against the Russian state, as it were. And of course, we know that his aeroplane then blew up in the middle of the sky on its way out of Moscow. So I think there are two sides to this. I'm sure there are people like Prigozhin in and around Moscow and the Kremlin who are deeply concerned of what's going on and are no doubt plotting to take over. And I'm sure there are other politicians, in inverted commas, in the Kremlin who would like to take over from Putin as well. But we know Putin runs a very tight ship. He's paranoid about his own security. His own security guards even have to get checked before they come and see him. And I personally believe he didn't go to Istanbul to the meeting that he'd arranged last week with President Zelensky because he was terrified that he would be taken out in Istanbul, either by Secret Service agents or even arrested. Let's not forget he is an indicted war criminal at the International Criminal Court. Lots of things I think going on at the moment, Putin. I think the Russian army itself is reaching its culminating point. In other words, running out of steam, and I think Putin is probably sitting very uncomfortably in the Kremlin at the moment, realizing that he's not going to achieve his objectives. The population are realizing, quite what a devastating thing he's done to the Russian country and the Russian people. And no doubt there will be a number of Russian generals and Russian politicians who are thinking about removing him and taking up the mantle themselves. We shall see. But let's hope that pressure does get Putin to the negotiation table before it's too late for the people who've got to fight in the front line at the moment, and too late for Putin himself.
But you believe that there could be some people inside Russia who would like to remove Putin from power, for example, in case if he fails in these negotiations, if he does not accept any kind of a ceasefire deal, or if he overplays his hand by pretending to have a peace deal, but by delaying this deal, just forcing Trump to walk away from these negotiations, leaving Russia in really bad condition, with really bad situation with this war going on.
I am sure there are people in Russia and in Moscow who are looking at what's going on at the moment, who are deeply dissatisfied with the way that Putin is running things, and are deeply dissatisfied the way the country's going, the economy's going, and everything else. And are probably hopeful, like the rest of the world is, that there will be a ceasefire and some sort of peace deal. I am sure that if Putin continues to ignore pleas for a ceasefire, continues to ignore the US president and the European leaders, then he is getting himself into an even more difficult position. And although we don't have a great sight of what's going on in Moscow because of the way that the state control the media and social media, I think one would be fairly confident that there are people ready to take over from Putin if he trips up much more. And let's hope that will be enough to get him to this negotiation table sooner rather than later.
And from your perspective, do you feel that Putin can just continue his war despite the negative effects on Russian economy? Can he just move forward with his war and decline all offers received from US President Trump, from European leaders? What could be with Putin's regime in such case if he just decides to continue his war without the possibility of achieving his maximalist aims, like just decide to continue his endless and war without any kind of a good objective achieved in the nearest future?
Well, the fact that he's kept going for 3 years really does worry us all, I think. His Achilles heel, I mean, his big weakness is going to be his ability to generate foreign income. And at the moment, virtually all of that comes from oil. But the fact that the price of oil is falling rapidly and the Americans and Saudis are pushing it below $50 a barrel gives one confidence that he can't keep going. At $50 a barrel, Russia, on its current spending on defense, is going to run out of money pretty quickly. And that will be the precursor, I expect, for Putin either having to negotiate a ceasefire or somebody in Russia replacing Putin.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me. Glory to Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much. Let's also cover Trump's national security team. Do you feel that Trump's national security advisors also understand that he is being played by Vladimir Putin, he's being manipulated by the Russian dictator, or are they just afraid of telling him the truth?
Well, I think it's probably some combination of that. Maybe Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, is telling him the truth, but there are others who listen to influencers like Tucker Carlson and Lara Loomer, who might as well be in the employ of the Kremlin. Nobody really knows for sure, but their views are certainly quite strange and very favorable to Russia. And that seems to be the direction that Trump continues to follow.
How can you see the possible outcomes of these negotiations, high-stake negotiations between Trump and Vladimir Putin? Because it seems like Trump has to show some kind of results after putting so much efforts in that, so much political efforts in this war, in solving this war.
Well, it's certainly the case that after saying during the campaign last year that he would just get Zelensky and Putin in a room and solve it in 24 hours, that manifestly hasn't happened now today, the 4th month since the inauguration. My guess is that Trump calculates that he will suffer minimum political damage with the failure of the ceasefire. Many in the U.S. would automatically blame it on Putin. And the real question remains, will Trump continue or perhaps even increase the supply of military assistance to Ukraine? It's one thing to walk away from the ceasefire talks. It's another thing to walk away from the assistance. Trump hasn't said anything definitively one way or the other. Hopefully Congress, which still contains many members very supportive of Ukraine, will appropriate some more funds and Trump won't stand in their way.
And also, do you feel that Trump's national security team is trying to persuade him to allow Ukraine to receive weapons from the United States, to continue military support for Ukraine?
I think they're divided internally within the administration. My guess is that Rubio does support additional assistance. But again, Vice President Vance has said as far back as the 2022 Senate campaign in Ohio, when he was elected, he didn't really care what happened in Ukraine. And that's obviously a very dangerous attitude to be that close to the president.
You just mentioned about the J.D. Vance. Recently he said, quote, "Putin doesn't seem to quite know how to get out of the war." Is he right?
No, I think Putin knows exactly what he's doing. He doesn't want to get out of the war. I could see a lot of reasons why Russians might say, we need a ceasefire. Our army has been chewed up. Much of our Black Sea fleet is now on the floor of the Black Sea, thanks to Ukraine. Maybe we can get out of some of these economic sanctions and actually make much more money on our sales of international oil. All of that, to me, would argue from Russia's own point of view that they should want a ceasefire. But if those arguments are being made internally at the Kremlin, they obviously have not yet persuaded Putin. So if he's doing what he wants, he may be right or wrong from Russia's point of view, but I think Putin at this point thinks he's on the course that he should be on.
Also, during negotiations last week in Istanbul, Russia has made unrealistic demands to the Ukrainian delegation. They demanded from Ukraine to withdraw its troops from 4 Ukrainian regions which are not fully occupied by the Russian side. From your perspective, is there any chance that Russia could make a compromise? Do you see this as a starting point for negotiations, or Russia's position which will not be changed?
I think the Kremlin knows they're not going to have that demand met, that the best they can do in the near term on a ceasefire is something along the existing battlefront, that you freeze the forces in place, that becomes the ceasefire line. So I suspect that making this more extravagant claim on all 4 of the provinces that they think should be Russian, that it's for domestic political purposes in Russia, but also to be used as a bargaining chip to get something else. I think what Putin is also interested in is redeployment of some NATO forces on Russia's flanks, maybe from the Baltics, maybe from Eastern Europe countries, NATO members. I don't think he should get that either, and I doubt that he will. But in his mind, the redeployment of NATO forces is important because it affects Russia's defensive posture. We see reports even today in the United States of buildup along the border with Finland. So I think Putin's got the big picture in mind here, again, from his perspective in Moscow, as part of this exercise to try and recreate the Russian Empire.
Do you expect any kind of a breakthrough in negotiations until the end of this year? And do you expect Trump to reach a ceasefire deal, to have any kind of success in that?
My best prediction at this point is Trump's going to back away from trying to negotiate a ceasefire. Perhaps something could change, a dramatic, unexpected development on the battlefield, or a decision by Trump to cease weapons assistance and other military assistance to Ukraine, which I think would be a huge mistake. But I think from Ukraine's perspective, that the government should be talking with European members of NATO against the contingency that Trump guts off support, to see if the Europeans can live up to their rhetoric and make up for any downturn.
If Donald Trump walks away from negotiations, from your perspective, will the US continue to provide Ukraine with military aid?
Well, I certainly hope so. And as I mentioned, I do think there's considerable support to continue, or in some cases increase, the military aid in Congress. We just want to be sure Trump doesn't veto it or doesn't encourage opponents of the military aid to be more active. If he simply says he'll continue the status quo in terms of weapons and ammunition and other military assistance, that would be satisfactory. It still means I think the Europeans are going to have to do more through the period through December 31st.
Also, do you expect U.S. Congress to impose sanctions on the Russian economy on its own? Because U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says that Republican senators and also Democratic senators are ready to make this decision on sanctions against Russian economy, but on their own, despite the position of the White House. And my question is, why on their own? They should do this on their own, but without the decision from the White House, without the support from the White House. Why does Trump hesitate to put pressure on Putin?
Look, he sees Putin as his friend. That's hard to explain, I know, but Trump thinks that if he has a good relationship, a friendship with a foreign leader, then the U.S. has good relations with that country. That's vastly oversimplified, but that's what he thinks, and he thinks he and Putin are friends. I don't believe that's how Putin sees the relationship, but Trump has given no indication, at least in the roughly 24 hours since his call with Putin, that he favors more sanctions. And my guess is if he called Lindsey Graham and said, don't proceed with this legislation, that Graham would back away. I think it's helpful to have it out there. Certainly it's something that Putin can't ignore as long as the legislation is pending. I'd be surprised if it moved forward quickly. Among other things, we're engaged in a huge domestic battle in Congress over the fiscal budget for the federal government. It's enormously complicated, and I don't think that there'll be much attention paid, certainly in the House or even the Senate, until we get this out of the way, probably within the next 30 days.
Just mentioned about the friendship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. What are the main reasons of this friendship, special relations, so-called special relations between Trump and Putin?
Well, it's a good question. I think in large part it's because Putin has so manipulated Trump based on his prior KGB career that Trump actually thinks they are friends. Trump has this fascination with authoritarian figures. He thinks he's friends with Xi Jinping of China, with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. When they first met in Singapore, Trump said about Kim Jong-un, "We fell in love." That's not how Kim Jong-un sees it, but this is how Trump can get wrapped up in his perceptions, which I think are incorrect, but which allow these authoritarian leaders to take advantage of him.
And he just being played by those authoritarian leaders during negotiations.
Yes, I think that's exactly what Putin has been doing to him since the inauguration.
And do you think that Marco Rubio or other members of Trump's national security team were present during phone calls between Trump and Putin?
I don't know. Normally, it's the practice that the national security advisor is on all calls with foreign leaders the president takes. Rubio is now holding both jobs as national security advisor and secretary of state, so he should have been on the call. I don't know that the White House has indicated one way or the other whether he was.
Let's also cover Putin's regime and recent recent article from the Washington Post. According to the Washington Post, interviews with Russian military commanders and Russian soldiers, most of the Russian soldiers today would be not satisfied with a peaceful settlement of the war unless Russia occupies 4 Ukrainian regions fully. What is your take on that, and does it mean that Putin is afraid of ending his war without achieving maximalist objectives?
Well, I think it's a reflection of 3+ years of Russian propaganda. I mean, in the West, many people talk about this as Putin's war, but I think it would be a mistake to ignore that Putin and his advisors in the Kremlin reflect a considerable body of Russian opinion. And over the past 35 years, they've convinced a lot of Russians that the breakup of the Soviet Union was a Western plot, and that Putin's effort to recreate the Russian Empire as he sees it is part of a war against the West. So if you've convinced people that that's actually what happened in history, these attitudes by the Russian soldiers make sense in that light. It happens to be wrong, but that's all they've heard for the past decade or so because of Putin's control over news and information inside Russia.
Also, there is an interesting debate among some analysts that if Putin accepts ceasefire deal on not really pro-Russian terms, on normal terms, then his regime could be endangered. His soldiers or other mercenaries could topple his regime. What is your take on this possibility?
Well, I don't see that at the moment. I think that's a useful thing for Putin to say to outsiders to justify his very tough position. But at this point, Russia isn't a government in a conventional sense of the word. It's like a criminal gang. And certainly the security forces, if they turned on whoever the leader was, that could end that leader's tenure in office. But I think Putin has mastered the levers of power inside the Kremlin, and I don't see him as threatened in the foreseeable future.
And also, according to the Washington Post, there is a big concern in Kremlin about the Russian soldiers who could go home after possible ceasefire deal and could endanger Putin's regime because of their violent nature and other, for example, psychological problems after participating in the war. What is your opinion on that?
Well, there may be some danger of that. We've seen some indications of dissatisfaction in the military, the incidents with the Wagner gang and Prigozhin, but people have also seen how Putin deals with dissent inside Russia. So I think while it may be possible, I'd again say I think that's unlikely as a real threat to Putin's power.
And what do you expect from Russian regime, from Putin in the upcoming months? What is your prediction on next Russia's decisions, next steps over Ukraine?
I think the best prediction you can make is that he will simply step up the pressure, hope for a breakthrough somewhere. They certainly haven't demonstrated any creative strategy since the original invasion, which failed on a number of fronts because of Ukrainian resistance. So despite the enormous human and material cost of the way the Russians conduct the war, my best guess is we'll just see more of the same.
And many military analysts believe that Russian army cannot fully occupy 4 Ukrainian regions. They can't cross the Dnieper River, capture the city of Kherson, the city of Zaporizhia. If Putin fails to achieve his maximalist objectives until the end of this year, would he be more positive toward reaching a ceasefire deal, for example, next year with Trump's administration?
Well, tomorrow is another day. Who knows? Next year it's possible, but